Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is, can you see me now? My name is Kevin Chege from the Internet Society. I work for the Africa Regional Bureau. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. This is my, I think, second SAFNOG meeting and also my, I think, third ION, I'm not sure. I always find them very interesting. So now we're going to have an IPv6 panel discussion. We were to have 3 panelists, but we have 2 panelists who I believe can cover a 3-hour event. So I think we are well in the green in that front. It'll be an interactive session. So anytime you have a question, feel free to walk to any of the mics, okay? So first of all, we'll start with introductions, although these gentlemen don't need any introductions, but we'll start with introductions. We have Andrew and Mark. Maybe Mark, because you have the mic, you can start first, and then Andrew.
I'm Mark.
From where?
Okay, no, more seriously, I'm Mark Elkins. I've been around on the internet landscape for the last 23, 30 or something, I don't know, years. All started with something called UUCP, and I've been, it's something that I enjoy, and I've been involved with the internet industry. Both from a CCTLD or almost a CCTLD running domain name systems to a registrar to a registrant, all sorts of things.
Hi, I'm Andrew. I'm Liquid's group head of IP strategy. Been around on the internet scarily enough, now that I think about it, 26 years since I was sneaking into academic institutions to get internet access and running up huge phone bills on dial-up systems. But yeah, and I head up strategy with regards to IP on the Liquid Telecom network for the group.
Thank you, Mark and Andrew. So we'll get going with the first question. So we'll go through a round of questions, then open up to the floor for those who want to ask them direct questions. So I'll start with you, Mark. You mentioned that you had IPv6 several years back. What motivated you to move to IPv6 or consider actually deploying IPv6 in your infrastructure?
Well, okay. So initially we were playing around on when we had this 3FFE address system, and eventually that closed down. It was more of a curiosity as much as anything. It was the future, but eventually it closed down. So a little bit more on the history on that and answering this question more precisely. Also being involved in the co.za domain name system, and it was only that at that point, what we could see is that IPv6 was definitely going to happen. It was going to happen within the next 2 or 3 or 4 years from when we were doing this. So back in around about 2006, I went to, we saw that from a domain name point of view, we needed to have IPv6 access and the ability for people to add IPv6 glue records into the domain name system in the same way that you have IPv4 glue records. And we didn't want to be a barrier to stopping people adopting IPv6. So essentially that was what the motivation was. And continuing the story a little bit, so in November 2006, there was an Afrinic meeting in Mauritius, and there was no policy though the only thing you could get was a /32, and Afrinic had just started doing that. But that was it. It was a 32 or nothing. But Uniforum at that time was already connected at Jinx, and it was connected to a couple of other different service providers. So it already had its own unique IPv4 address space and ASN. And it didn't make sense to have a 32, but there was no policy for a 48, a /48. So I started writing a policy for a /48 and pushed that in. So at that meeting, I was pushing for /48s to happen. There was a gentleman from the United States that decided that I was totally and utterly wrong, which basically sunk that policy at the meeting. It had to be extended for another 6 months. But in the meantime, I had got a /32. I got the /32. Well, I applied for it around about the time of the meeting, and by the first few days of Jan, I had it. And then I assigned /48 to Uniforum, the COSA registry people. And so Uniforum at least had an IPv6 from back there. The domain name system, long before EPP, was extended to allow for IPv6 glue records, and then we also configured the DNS servers to actually answer on IPv6. So, and the machines were given IPv6, so you could actually do anything and everything with COSA on IPv6 from probably about February, March 2007. Later on in June 2007, next AFRINIC meeting, and that dear little American person wasn't there, and we were able to push through the /48 policy. So, sorry? Come on, I can see smiles in the room. Everyone knows who I'm talking about. So, that was the problem, and that was the challenge, and that was the motivation.
Thanks, Mark. Andrew?
Well, I'm going to go back a little bit in history here and say something that's probably a bit shocking. Most of my career as it sits today, I can trace back to say thanks to IPv6. To tell the story, I found myself working for the University of Cape Town back probably about 2004, 2005. And I'd heard about this thing called IPv6, and I thought, well, this is worth playing, and guess what? I want it. So I went to Tenet, the South African NREN, and I said, hi, University of Cape Town wants IPv6, and they looked at me and went, yeah, if you want it, you'll have to do it yourself. And so we put in some FreeBSD boxes, and I did some hacking to the GRE code in the FreeBSD kernel to make it work, and we rolled out IPv6, and well, long story, but one thing after another. On the basis of that, I actually found myself working at Tenet as Tenet CTO for the next 6 or 7 years, and from there branched out into Liquid. Now, in my experience in that and watching how much we managed to get done, that V6 drive also, I brought that into Liquid as well. Liquid was already doing IPv6 before I got there. Just for the record, I was not the guy who brought V6 to Liquid. That was on the network, and I think a lot of it had to do with a particular customer that wanted it, thanks to Mark telling them that they had to get it. But from a Liquid perspective, we know that V4 is coming to an end. V4 is going to be extremely expensive. If I've got to buy in the secondary market, the AFRINIC pool on V4 is limited, and even with it not being limited, getting space, I don't know anybody who's done an IPv4 application lately, but wow, what a process. And so my simple view is that V6 is no longer even a separate part of the network. It's just part of what we do. Just like I need ISIS, just like I need V4 addresses in certain parts, just like I need BGP, I need IPv6. It's just another building block. And so I don't think there's any more real motivation anymore, because it's a fundamental part of what we do. It is ingrained in everything. We don't consider a network a full network without IPv6 anymore.
Thanks, Mark and Andrew. One of the reasons people put up as reasons, I have them called as excuses in the morning, why they've not moved to IPv6, is that they fear the challenges that come with IPv6 in terms of migrating equipment, doing the dual stack, doing the DNS, and so on. What would you say to people trying or people planning to move to IPv6? What are the challenges they would expect? What's the planning they need to put into place what would you advise them from your experience?
Okay, so firstly, to the people who are scared of challenges, get out of the industry. Sorry to say that bluntly, but we don't work in a simple industry. You know, this is an industry that will throw you challenges every day. Customers are going to ask for some very difficult things. They're going to ask for things they don't quite understand some of the time, and you're going to have to make a plan. IPv6 is no different from that. With regards to specifics, though, for years and years, even in the V4 world, people have not planned their address space. That is important. If you don't plan your address space, you will run into really major headaches. You've got a vast amount of address space, and, well, most people don't count very well in hexadecimal. So you tend to see that, you know, people haven't realized that after 9 doesn't come 10, after 9 comes A. And so you see some really, really interesting things appearing on the network because people aren't planning it properly before they go out and deploy, and you end up with ranges all over the place. With regards to the dual stacking, you shouldn't hit a problem dual stacking unless you've done something really broken because they run as separate stacks. Obviously, if you're running like we are with single topology, what you could find is if you don't do your V6, then the V4 adjacency is not going to form in your IGP. You know what? That's exactly the way it should be. Because that way you know that they both work. But my message to people is stop treating V6 like some special holy cow. If you treat it like just another building block, you're not going to see all of these mythical challenges that people keep claiming because they aren't there. It's just another part of the network.
So what challenges did I have? From my own company at the time, no problems at all, because I knew the manager, the owner of the company pretty well, and we both agreed when I looked in the mirror. So that wasn't a problem. So I didn't have that manager saying no type problem. The biggest problem from getting the appropriate address space from the uniform registry point of view was there was no policy, so the Afrinic at the time couldn't actually give me what we were asking for. So that was probably the biggest problem there. But the meeting that, I think it was in June 2007, I think that was the meeting in Morocco, Rabat or something. And at that meeting, I was able, or maybe it was the meeting after that, but it was one of those meetings that, the other excuse, dress planning, I actually gave a talk on address planning, on how I would use my /32, how it would be regionalized for aggregation from a district, from a regional point of view, etc. And so these weren't challenges as in something that you had to climb over. These were challenges in how I would help teach other people, I would like to think. So from my point of view, there weren't too many challenges apart from having a policy suitable so that we could actually apply for the address space we wanted.
Andrew?
Just to add one other thing that is, the one thing that I do think I need to raise as a potential challenge. In a large organization, you've got a lot of engineers. And you've got to convince those engineers of the value of what you're doing. Because even at a management level, you can push down and say, do this, do this, do this. But if you don't get them interested and let them see the value of it, be it financial or be it a case where they can prove that they can do something that other people can't, whatever it is, you're going to run into problems. Because engineers like to keep their life simple. And there is a lot of view that, well, why am I doing this? Who cares? It's a second-class citizen. And so you need to find a way to constantly engage the engineers and keep them interested. And I still struggle with that. It's not the easiest thing to do, to stop engineers believing that V6 is a second-class citizen. Hence, again, why we run single topology, because it forces it.
Okay, so we've had, what your motivations have been and some of the challenges and how you've overcome them. A lot of questions I get from the engineers I meet also revolves around costs. So we've heard about the costs of what it's going to take to keep IPv4 for the next few years. What are the costs related for those who want to move on to IPv6? Are there any costs related to actually moving to IPv6? What would you consider? I see someone at the mic. Is it a question related to? Okay, let's take that question first.
It's in a sense related to your question around
Introduce yourself.
Sorry,
please.
my name's Graham from the internet. Graham Benniker from the internet. It is in a sense related to your question around cost. My experiences with IPv6 in the last year or two have been largely dealing with enterprise users, large business users with a large internal network that I as the ISP don't have an insight into. So my question is kind of quite broadly, in your experiences of rolling out IPv6, it's easy when you control the infrastructure, when you are the customer, when you are the one doing the implementation on the end device. In an environment like a university, you also very much control all the way down to the LAN. But on the one hand, in sort of getting into the mindset of the engineers in the enterprise space, what have you seen in terms of driving factors, enterprises demanding IPv6? Have you seen enterprise demanding IPv6? And on the other side of it, do you see that the costs are being prohibitive for them, or do you see that they're not wanting to do it as a result?
Okay, so here's what I see as a problem with a lot of the enterprises, particularly the larger ones. They've got V4 space. They run much more static networks than your typical operator do, so they're not needing more and more V4 space. So they're not seeing the risk of run out of V4 space. What they see is, this works. And so you run into a case of why change this? So that's thing number one. It's not really a cost issue. It's a case of don't change what works. The other thing that I've seen which has caused a number of issues is the fact that a lot of big enterprises are running on L3 VPN networks. And V6 and L3 VPNs have not always gelled so nicely for all the reasons I spoke about earlier with regards to MPLS and V6. That's changing, but I think it's a case of you've got to talk to your customer. You can never force a customer to take something, right? I can't walk onto their network and deploy it, and I can't force them to take it. But it's a matter of talking to them constantly. Are we getting enterprises asking for V6? One or two, but not many. That's a matter of education. It's about constantly talking to the customer and finding a way to convince them. If anybody's got a solution on the easy way to convince an enterprise to do this when they don't actually see a financial benefit to it, please let me know, because I haven't found it yet, but we're going to keep trying.
Yes, if it works, why change it? People hate change, and that's probably the biggest issue. If you've already got enough address space and it's working fine, there is no incentive. In the case of Uniforum, and I used Uniforum because that was the name of the organization at the time, the incentive to move was to make sure that we were not an artificial barrier to other people wanting to do it. So we were looking at reputation. From a cost point of view, I don't know that I ever spent any money for either myself or Uniforum in deploying IPv6. In fact, I think the first recordable time I actually spent or bought something is recently, a few weeks ago, I wanted IPv6 at home. The modem that I was using was 10 years old or something. It had never been hit by lightning, because I also make sure that doesn't happen. And that actually became a problem because the modem couldn't do V6. So I had to go out and buy a 300 Rand modem that could do IPv6 tunnels. So in order to get the Hurricane Electric tunnel to work. I think that's the only time I've actually gone to the shops to buy money to get kit so that I can run IPv6.
Andrew?
Just one other note about cost. I wouldn't say that we spent a lot of money doing IPv6. Where we have been cases where we haven't asked for it in the beginning because of mistakes or lack of knowledge on people who were buying things or whatever it was. In most cases where those situations have cropped up, we've had big fights with vendors and managed to get them to do it for free. I will say, as a warning to people out there, dependent on the vendor, and particularly if you are buying from certain Far East vendors who will remain unnamed, if you do not ask for V6 up front, they will deliver your hardware, it will not have it, and when you ask for it, you will be facing a massive license fee. If you ask for it up front, though, there's no cost to it whatsoever because they want the sale. But don't ask for it afterwards because you'll end up paying. So that's my warning. You've got to make sure that when you buy something, you actually explicitly put it in there, because otherwise you will get it later, but it's going to cost you. So that's the only time where there's cost. Otherwise, everything supports it. It's there.
There is a cost, though. The cost is time, and the cost is sitting down and making sure that wherever you currently collect an IPv4 address from a logs point of view, that space in the database is big enough for an IPv6 address. Or explicitly, wherever you push out an IPv4 address for a customer, you also can do the same with V6. So there are costs involved, but it's human costs. And it doesn't matter when you start, you're going to have those costs. And I would, if you don't do IPv6 today, I would be more concerned about how much it is going to cost you if you don't do it.
Before you answer, I see Mukoma has been standing for a long time. Let's hear, maybe it's related to this. Mukom, please.
Yeah, Mukom, I'm from Afrinic Limited. So the last contribution that Andrew made kind of spoke to what I had in mind and what happens with legacy equipment, particularly large blocks of it that gets bought by organizations. Now, all of you at some point, your equipment was not always IPv6 compliant. So I'm curious, when you got rid of equipment that is not V6 compliant, what do you do with it?
In most cases, you upgrade the software. You don't necessarily have to replace the hardware. Otherwise, standard hardware is depreciated, normal disposal mechanisms. You know, there's nothing special about this. I don't replace hardware because it doesn't support V6. I tell the vendor to give me a new version of code, and I fight for it until I get it. You know what I mean? I don't think I can point to a case of hardware that I've actually deliberately replaced because of V6. And then it's just stock standard, you know, hardware gets replaced, hardware gets recycled, I send it back to the stores, and what they do with it, I don't know. You know, that's...
Now, that part, I think it's important that you get to know, because typically, what I've seen countries where there's a big market for second-handed electronic equipment and devices like this. Sometimes they get donated to universities. And you have a poor network engineer in a university that wants to deploy IPv6. You can't get equipment because it's a donation of equipment, and that's just doomed. And the second question, if you've got any advice for those operators that made the mistake of not demanding V6 for large blocks of purchases, and only thought about that because I have at least 2 operators that are in that exact same problem. We went through V6 deployment, you know, they actually tested in a mobile phone, did a launch where the company CEO came out, no, we are launching IPv6. 2 weeks later, they launched their LTE product and the CPE 0v6. And it's been like that. So if there's some some advice you can offer to those guys, that really would be appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, I can give you advice on that very simply. You go to the vendor and go, I've rolled an LTE network, I'm going to be needing a lot more hardware. You either fix what's there, or I'm going elsewhere for what's coming. And if need be, you run a tender and you go and buy something else. Doesn't even have to be a lot, just to demonstrate the point. Your vendors will come around pretty fast. Trust me on this, they don't want to lose. And then the only other thing that I wanted to say is, Mark, you and I agree on most things, but I disagree with you on the human cost side of things. And I'll tell you why. In running any network, there is a cost in running a network. And if we're going to say that we are treating V4 and V6 the same way, and they're building parts of the same network, and you run it as a completely, you know, as symbiotic to one another, the amount of time is the same as running the other network. It's one network. It's not a case of vast amount of time invested in trying to add things and develop things and maintain two separate networks. It's not, it's one network. So, I mean, if I look in our Zimbabwe V6 deployment, where we've got tens of thousands of users, there's no extra time load involved in there. Yeah, there was a week or two to add to modify the systems, but it was minimal. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's not what I would call real time.
Yes, but it does happen. If you were listening and awake at the time when Martin Levy was doing his remote presentation, choosing my words.
Presentation, get your heads out of the gutter, please.
Presentation. Then what you did hear him say is they eventually removed the switch that said no IPv6, so that everything was IPv6. And the eyeballs were quite happy, it made no difference. On the other hand, it broke stuff in the back. It broke the logging stuff. So there is a cost, there is a development cost. Maybe it needs to be brought to consideration.
Maybe I can add, in my days when I was a network engineer at Kenneth, we were running OSPF at the time, and when we decided to move to V6, there was a whole reconfiguration of the routers to add the OSPF v3, and we had to do it for like 120 routers. So there was a small cost in terms of time, not money, but you know, staff time. Someone has to sit down, make sure all the configs are okay, everything works, and so on. I want to touch on something you've mentioned, Andrew, about businesses and the corporates. I know corporates spend a lot of time planning for business continuity, like disaster recovery and so on. My expectation would be involving, you know, planning for IPv6 would be part of that business continuity, because as we know, it's a matter of time before V6 is actually a must. So would you say that would be a motivation that Liquid could use to get more people on board, get more people encouraged to, you know, move to V6?
It's an incredibly hard argument to make, surprisingly. And you see, for us as operators, we see that as an easy argument because, well, we're going to run out of V4. But these corporates have V4, and they're not opening tens of thousands of branches all over the place. They've got enough for their needs. And the reality is that, yes, we all know that sooner or later something's going to go V6 only. But they'll turn around and they'll go, well, by that point, there'll be NAT 6.4. There'll be 464 XLAT. And the transition mechanisms that we've come out with, I would argue, have probably hurt the deployment of V6 more than anything. It's the same way that NAT in itself, NAT 4.4, has hurt the deployment of V6. I can tell you now, had we not had NAT 4.4, we'd all be running V6 10 years ago because, well, there'd have been no other option. And that's why that argument is so damn difficult to make, because the reality is, does a corporate that is running V4 that can translate it really need it when they're not running out? Probably not, sadly. We've got to be honest about that. They probably don't. It's the operators that need it and the people who are expanding and the new companies, but the current corporates who are happy with what they've got, It's not a need at this point.
Want to say something, Mark? Okay. Just a reminder to the audience, anytime you have a question, comment, please feel free to walk to the mic. It's an interactive session.
And if anyone wants to throw things at me for that last comment, feel free.
Aim at Andrew, don't hit me, please. Yes, Graham.
Graham from the internet. Just to respond to your question about business continuity and those sort of things. Business continuity is always, it comes under the insurance grudge purchase column. And so businesses are always looking for ways to avoid it. They are going to try and rationalize their way out of any expenditure there that goes beyond, or not even expenditure, any effort there that goes beyond the bare minimum, potentially statutory requirement for that business. And so my experience is that for something as abstract as IPv4 and IPv6, the banks have to have backups of all of their tapes. And in many countries it's a statutory requirement, and they understand that, and the Reserve Bank or the banking authority or whatever imposes it on that. But IP and internet is already so abstract for these decision makers, trying to equate IPv4 and IPv6 that they already can't tangibly grapple with IPv4. It's a bit of a lost cause in my experience, because you're asking them to make a grudge purchase on something that they don't understand, and so their default is going to be to just reject it.
Thanks, Graham. Okay, someone else come to the mic. Mukon.
Are you two alternating, taking turns or something? Where's the rest of the people?
No, Andrew did ask that we could throw things at him, so I brought some things to throw at you. Now, I think based upon the survey results we had, I think there's a big correlation between what you said for enterprise networks, and the exact wordings we had was, you know what, this is not a problem, it's not a priority. We have IPv4. We haven't even used the V4 that we got. And those were word verbatim responses for that.
You should be reclaiming that if they're saying that. That's the Afridic rules.
Well, I did promise that the answers and their names will remain. I won't share them with African Registration Services Department. Now, there's something else I want to ask your opinion about, because some of the guys that we've trained, and a couple of them after trainings have come back to us, Tamil, we've deployed IPv6. And every single time, there's been, 3 or 4 people that did it on the core, never on the access network, never to the content network. And every single time I asked them, he said, you know what, Taman, if it's the core network, I and my 4 guys, we can do this. But for the access network, that's a big ball of other stuff that's outside of my control. What advice do you have for guys like this?
You want to take this? Okay, no, let me try and address this. Firstly, as I said, you've got to get your engineers across the company wanting this. We talk about having a champion in a company to champion V6, and it's something that's preached all over the place. But you know what? The problem is how people view that champion. They view it as the guy who's got to do it all. That is not the role of a champion. The role of the champion is to get other people interested enough to do it. He is a means to delegate down. And the guys that you are training, their job is not to go and roll it all the way to the access network. Their job and what they need to be taught is to take what they've been trained and skill out across the organization and build that interest and build that desire. If I look at our own V6 rollout, I did the BRASs, I made sure that a lot of the core stuff, and I worked very closely. But without my guys on the ground, guys like Anthony Somerset in Zimbabwe, and guys like Tanashi, and my guys at Zimbabwe Online, who put a lot of effort in, and the developers, etc., it wouldn't have happened. I had to work with them, encourage them, make them interested. You cannot rely on one person that you've trained to go and roll it out. He's got to be trained. The only reason you're training him is so that he can train everybody else. That's his job as a champion, to bring other people to the table. Because if you don't do that, you're never going to get it to the edge. Not in a big network. There are too many people involved, too many parts.
And don't you think that that's where the role of their manager comes in? Because a champion is not just, push it down, but also play the politics, getting peers and
But the
protection.
champion's role is also not just to push it down. He's got to push it up as well.
Exactly, that's what I wanted to say.
You've got to get these guys talking and talking and talking, and they've got to fight. They've got to have big mouths like me and not shut up until people listen.
It has to be in the genes. Some of them don't have it in the genes like you.
There's a chicken and egg situation. Why must the LIRs, for example, go out and get V6? Or if they've got V6 because we've been making a lot of noise about it, where's the incentive to deploy it? Now, I'm sure I've discussed this with a few people in the room before, but I would be interested in a new Afrinic policy. And the Afrinic policy would go something along the lines of, if you have no IPv numbering resources from Afrinic, then you can just talk to them, doesn't matter how, V4, V6, Telex, or whatever that Afrinic can accept. If you have V4 and you have no V6, then the only thing you can ask them for numbering resources is a V6. You cannot ask them for more V4 until you have V6. And then once an LIR has a V6, the only way he can ask for more V4 is over a working V6 connection from their address space, which has already been previously allocated to them from Afrinic. Would that work?
That's an interesting proposal.
Can we make an extension to this? Can we close the Afrinic mailing lists to non-V6 address mailers? What? I think this is the most brilliant idea you've had all day.
Afrinica in the room, they can guide us to that. But hold that thought. Let's hear from Jan, who's been at the mic.
Well, Jan George, you just removed the IPv4 address from the Afrinic mail server, do you, right? And you don't close anything, right?
Exactly. It's so easy.
Okay, so my thought was, it was sparked when you discussed about this transition and translation technologies and the pain of all of them. And for the full disclosure, I am at the co-author of one of them, that being A+P, address plus port, that today results in MAP-E, MAP-T, and lightweight 4/6 and things like this. Back in time, we needed to give the carrier grade net sort of like an alternative. So we thought about A+P with Randy Bush, Nokia, Juniper guys, and my other co-authors. But what happened back then was, today we have 13 different transition technologies. All of them suck. Let's make the one that will replace them all. And after we were done, we had 14 transition mechanisms. Right? But to a little bit explain why we went down this path. IPv6 was meant to replace IPv4 and was meant to be deployed way before IPv4 would deplete. That means that would be quite a logical and natural and painless transition from one protocol to another. But unfortunately, we all collectively failed. And the sign of our failure is today around 20 transition mechanisms that nobody really understands how to use them. So we need to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, Jan, I don't fault anybody halfway down the line for writing a transition mechanism or trying to improve them. My simple point is that had no one come out with a transition mechanism, the problem is that once there was one, there were always going to be more. And it's not even the transition mechanism. It started with the person who invented NAT. And the problem with the NAT paradigm is made worse by the fact that in the late 90s, Cisco came out with a Cisco PIX, and it wasn't selling too well. So they really needed to kind of promote it, and they went, well, what does it do? Well, it does NAT. So they went out, and they decided to call NAT a security mechanism. And they sold the world a lie. And
I thought NAT was a firewall.
And so NAT became synonymous with security. So now when you're trying to do V6, you've got an even bigger problem because people are like, I'm losing my security that's coming from NAT. There's no security in NAT. And so NAT was a bad idea in the first place because it was a transition, it was a means of extending V4, and I think that anything that artificially extends V4 is damaging. It created a lie about security which too many people bought into, which now makes V6 harder to deploy. And then people started inventing transition mechanisms for 6 to 4, and to make it even worse, somebody has now even written 6 to 6 NAT and needs to be shot for it. You know, it's a big problem. But yes, the 20 plus years we failed. We did, for all the trying. And I also put that blame squarely on the vendors. I put that blame on operators that didn't look at the technology soon enough and demand what they really needed it for. No MPLS, for example. Why are the operators not screaming at the vendors and screaming at the IETF 10 years ago? But yes, those transition mechanisms hurt us.
Now, I want to ask you a question related to vendors and what you've talked about the IETF. The IETF, people say, I've had your gripe about the IETF. Depending on who you talk to, they'll say that's not a bug, it's a feature of the IETF. As Liquid, beyond talking to your vendors, to push the changes that you want, the MPLS and so on, have you also considered sending people from Liquid, from this region, to the IETF to participate or join a couple of mailing lists? And the reason I ask that is because every time I manage to go to an IETF, there are questions towards, they want to get more people from the region to participate because they feel that in a couple of working groups that I've, the people I've talked to, they don't have the voice from the region. So they don't know whether the stuff that's coming out of the IETF is actually scalable in Africa. So as Liquid, as a big ISP in the region, have you guys considered possibly sending people to these meetings to represent your views, represent your, put your complaints to some of these working groups?
Okay, so firstly, are people in Liquid reading the IETF mailing lists? Yes, definitely. And in fact, recently when I was talking to people about coming into the innovation side in Liquid, I made it very clear that part of the job description was to read everything that ever comes out of the IETF, because I need to know what's coming in order to innovate and to develop, etc. Sending people there? No, we haven't done that yet. It's something that we will consider doing in the future, but at the moment, because of the deep relationships that we have with the vendors, it's easier, less time consuming, less expensive to push that stuff to the vendors. I think there is an assumption that because an operator like us isn't standing at a microphone in the IETF, that our voices aren't getting heard. I would argue that our voices are getting heard because I see some of the things we're saying appearing in mails to IETF mailing lists from the vendors. It's just far, far, far easier. I see the point about people getting onto the mailing lists and bringing the African message to the IETF. But my concern is if I send someone to the IETF at the moment and they walk into the political mess that is the IETF and find the vendor playground that seems to exist there, they'll go the first time. Are they ever going to return? And I'd rather ensure that by the time I do send people, they know what they're getting into. We need to be honest about the quagmire that is the IETF at the moment. Otherwise, you're sending people and they will not be back. It would be very interesting to conduct a survey of new people who've been to the IETF in the last 3-5 years and see how many of them are still coming back. That would be a very interesting to see. What is the churn rate because of what goes on in the IETF? And I would encourage ISOC to do a survey like that because I think it would actually be very revealing. As I say, we are reading, and believe me, if we see something on there that the vendors aren't dealing with, that we need to say something